up my dissertation. Oh, I should be finishing up my dissertation right about now. Alas, I've missed another deadline. Truthfully, the opportunity to speak in an open setting such as this was just too good to pass up. I'm so glad you are here. Many thanks to Alexander Moore for all his efforts getting CPPI off the ground and structuring it so that members have a forum to speak about what we are interested in. Many thanks to the other members of the Institute as well. The talk I'm giving today is based on the introduction to my dissertation and also serves to introduce a paper I wrote. You may read either if you wish. Just email me if you would like a draft of the dissertation. In the dissertation, I articulate a philosophy of mathematics. Today, we will focus on the idea of form and the idea of number. But to give a sense of what the whole project is about, let us consider this first image, which is of a flower blooming alongside work samples that represent the concept 2/3. The first image represents 2/3 as 2 times 3, which is understandable but not quite right. Next is a vertically partitioned circle. The pieces are not symmetric here, so it's also not quite right. And the next picture is of a radially partitioned circle, and this is getting closer to adequacy. And last, we have a perhaps more adequate representation. And so 2/3 goes on a journey, and I don't think we should think of that journey as closed. It is ongoing. Note that this image as a whole is a new representation of 2/3. It's meant to evoke the idea that mathematics is a becoming. It is a developmental movement whose representations have not been exhausted. Philosophy is also like this. The following talk is intended to be emergent and is necessarily incomplete, but I will try to lead you on a circular journey and see if we all might learn something along the way. As we proceed through the talk, consider how thinking about mathematics and philosophy in this way relates to ideas of certainty, and how changing our cultural understandings of mathematics to be about the becoming of mathematical knowledge could change our systems of schooling in emancipating ways. Those extensions will largely be absent from this talk, which is really about the math more than about educational systems. Please type your questions in the chat box as they arise so that I can be sure to return to them at the end. Alex will monitor the chat box and interrupt me if there's an issue with my sound or video, so I can loop back around to whatever might have been lost. Just as a note, I'm methodologically committed to the idea that understanding is emergent and never complete. This is sometimes frustrating, and this talk may frustrate too, though I hope it's fun, and I encourage you to approach it with the spirit of play. I'd like to begin with a moment of silence. The talk is structured to begin with an original and internally complex unity of some sort, which must be articulated, differentiated, to be intelligible. But that articulation loses, cannot fully express in predicative terms, the original but inarticulate unity which must be restored. As we sit for a moment, ponder the ways in which your experience is rhythmic. For me, silence is not empty. Of course, there are sounds from fans blowing, traffic, or dogs scratching in the other room. But for me, silence is more like a vacuum, a void or desire that wants to be filled and is filled by inner speech. When I rehearsed this talk earlier, I was thinking about how long I should let the moment of silence go on. When will it get weird? Do I need it to get weird to make my point that silence is not empty, salient? When will people start to think this is just a goofy talk and simply leave? What if no one takes me seriously? Have I prepared enough for this talk? Are they all going to laugh at me? My position as leading the seminar may make me uniquely neurotic, but I suspect that your experience of silence likewise was not empty. Even in stillness, the mind moves. Perhaps you experienced inner speech, as I did, as a kind of rehearsal of what you might say, or as words that give shape to your existential fears and desires. Perhaps, like me, you had the desire to speak, to fill the silence. The fears I expressed and called neurotic are existential in the sense that they relate to threats to my social being and the possible loss of recognition. Criticality often implies attending to existential identity needs that include needs for dignity, respect, recognition, self-realization, in addition to the material needs of people who are oppressed through caste systems that cultures impose. I feel smaller when misrecognized or when I err, and bigger in a proprioceptive sense when recognized. Recognition affirms our social existence, and reciprocal recognition transforms the I-you into a we. Some people may be skeptical about the possibility of being recognized. In some philosophies of mathematics education, there is a claimed gulf of intelligibility between subjects. Philosophies that begin with lonely consciousness have trouble explaining our social connectedness. Instead of lonely consciousness, it is important to begin with intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity in the Habermasian sense is a necessary assumption. It is something that we assume in every communicative act. It has different moments in the sense that it is a concept that needs to be unwound. The first moment in this telling is the assumption of communicative competence. I assume that the other with whom I am speaking can, in principle, understand what I'm talking about. If we are ever in a condition where the other is fully opaque to us, the actual response is quietism. There is a reason why I wanted to speak to a group like this, rather than go out to the quarry and talk to rocks. Why? Well, one reason is that my relationship to rocks is not one of possible reciprocal recognition. I can position take with a rock, imagining its being, but I don't think rocks position take with me. They are not sitting there thinking, I wonder what Tio is trying to get at, which I hope you all are doing. The relevant subject positions are first person, a variety of second person positions that tend towards universality, and third person observer positions. This movement between subject positions, which is part of the competency assumed in every communicative act, cannot be represented within the act itself. That is, I can say, I assume you're a competent communicator, but this act is itself predicated under the assumption of such competency. Intersubjectivity is the not this of communicative action. In my interpretation, it is the Hegelian negative. The second Hegelian negative I want to discuss is desire. Desire is a negative as it is a not this or not yet of the object so desired. I'm speaking here because I want to be understood. I want to be recognized. Call this desire the recognition desire. Talking to rocks cannot fill this void. Desire in a poetic sense is a lack of a fire, a void, a darkness of constant pursuit. The mind moves, the body moves, the world moves. I tried to make the moment of silence long enough to feel weird so that we could have some common experiential referent for this void that wants to be filled. This desire can be filled through acts of consumption, which are object negations, but it can also be filled through recognition. The recognition desire can even be momentarily sated by recognizing itself in a circle that Hegel might call spirit. And I just want to add a little bit to the text here. Recognizing the recognition's desire to be recognized forms an interesting little loop that we might call spirit. It requires the not this of surrender, which is the letting go of conceptual distinctions. The desire for recognition precedes and unifies communicative actions. This type of action is action oriented towards reaching understanding, and it stands opposed to instrumental action, which is goal-oriented and non-social, or strategic action, which is goal-oriented and social. Let us symbolize the recognition desire with what I call the null representation. Mathematicians may recognize this as the empty set, the set with no elements. Throughout, I treat braces and quotation marks as intersubstitutable. It is important for the notion of number that I will get to later on in the seminar. But it's hard to understand emptiness, and so it's hard to teach what an empty set really is. Instead, the recognition desire will fill that role. Where Frege would put the judgment stroke, I will put the null representation. So in the communicative action, like saying, "You are beautiful," I will put the null representation right up front. You are beautiful. The last Hegelian negative I wish to discuss is the I. The I is not discovered as something positive, not as an object or an appearance or an entity of any sort, but rather a condition for the possibility of any object or appearance at all. So the I in reflection itself enters into representational frameworks as the negative. To clarify this, attend to an object. For example, here's a pen. As I attend to the pen, the I, as the locus of pure subjectivity and agency, is not the pen. Part of what is meant by I is the not this of the object of thought. When we try to capture the I with an image, that image is the object of thought, no longer the I. In this image, I represent a pen without a problem, but when I try to represent the I on the same page, my subjective experience is not within that page. The I has moved on. The I is no longer itself when recollected, but it's important to the act of recollection because it brings the various moments of a temporally extended action into one experience that's mine. The I, in a personal sense, is what unifies our actions, including our communicative actions. What makes the biomechanical movement to the grocery store an action is its mineness. I am doing it and know I'm doing it in the same moment. The same is true of our speech actions. We could just as easily use the null representation to refer to intersubjectivity, the recognition desire, or the I. As negatives, they are all unrepresentable. Below, I use the word infinite interchangeably with all three and with the negative in general. I italicize the in here because the notion I am trying to express is the non-finite non-thing. The infinite should be distinguished from mathematical infinity, which Hegel called the bad infinity of n+1. I will try to define the mathematical infinity as well with the successor function in just a few minutes. Oops. Each is a limit of knowledge. Our knowledge of the negative is only through reflection, which means we do not experience any of these negatives in the same moment as our reflective knowledge of those moments of being. Limits to knowledge are not just constraints on what we can know, they are actually core structures of what we are, like the I. We, in some sense, are the recognition desire, intersubjectivity, and the I, which are these limits of knowledge. We approach these limits so that our understanding of the negative is emergent and never fully complete. This is another sense of the infinite. It is processual. Each of these unrepresentable negatives is understood in different ways. The way that they unfold the consciousness is different. Derridian deconstruction will allow us to take responsibility for undifferentiating between these negatives. Before that, let us return to this experience of silence to unpack a bit more about the idea of existential needs. My supposed neuroticism reveals that not only do I want to be understood, but I also want to be appreciated. I want the work to go over well. I want to be recognized as a good person doing good work. This is an existential need to be recognized as a good person, and it is sensitive to the propriety of use for various expressions. I won't start cursing or calling people nasty names to prove the point that goodness and language are related. Moreover, language has certain conditions for intelligibility. In an everyday circumstance, if I were to say is, for example, you would probably not understand what I was getting at. I say this to suggest that part of our being involves using language according to the communicative or rational norms of the recognitive communities to which we belong. I will name this existential need the synthetic unity of apperception because it is language-based negation to form a oneness. Speaking a sentence is saying no to or excluding all other possible sentences. When I speak a sentence like "you are beautiful," you might understand that sentence by relativizing it against all other possible speech acts in a normative space, partially or fully negating many of them, and allowing others of them to be inferential antecedents or consequents, which are still the not this of the spoken sentence. That is to say that in saying "you are beautiful," that precludes entitlement to "you are ugly" and entitles other commitments. The synthetic unity of apperception is one side of the recognition desire. It is one moment in the wave of the sound of time. But here I'm doing something a little strange in an academic talk. Most academic talks are so time crunched that beginning with 30 seconds of silence just to make the audience feel uncomfortable is a little antagonistic. Moreover, I'm allowing this talk to unfold in a circle rather than a linear pathway, so it's a bit bizarre, at least for non-Hegelians. So I, in a very minor way, am flouting the communicative norms of academic seminars and implicitly asserting new norms. The greater critique is that people are often quite attached to the communicative norms surrounding mathematics. After all, we supposedly fought at least 2 math wars in the United States. This kind of critique exercises the existential need to be recognized as infinite, an entity capable of reflecting on the norms of a community and negating those norms, thus experiencing a certain kind of discursive growth. As such an entity, there is always more to say. I name this existential need to be recognized as infinite after Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. I will try to make this relationship clearer in a bit when I discuss the transcendental I. At this stage, the infinite is neither the critiqued norms nor the new norms asserted in critique. It is the movement between those 2 sets of proprieties. In some sense, the infinite is the no that we all say in our own ways. One way to say this is that critique is ontological. It is part of our being as no-sayers, who say no with reasons, and we need recognition for this aspect of our being. Critiquing the norms of a community by acting outside of them asserts new norms. The existential need to be recognized as infinite often leads us to what members of those recognitive communities would call bad behavior. When we act outside the norms of a recognitive community, we risk our membership in that community. Critique comes with existential risks. Now, the disruption of a little silence won't get me booted from the Institute, in part because this institutional space is predicated on critique. It is in the name that Alex came up with. Institutional spaces and recognitive communities that invite the critique of their own norms are positioned to explicitly recognize their constituents' existential needs to be recognized as infinite. My experiences of K-12 mathematics has been that math classrooms emphatically disregard the need to be recognized as infinite because they expect rigid adherence to norms. The correctness-incorrect binary leaves little room for critique. I struggled with math growing up and frankly still do, but when I was 16, it finally dawned on me that all I had to do was exactly what I was told to be successful in mathematics. I shouldn't even try to understand. In critical mathematics, correctness is still important. We want to be able to critique the inferential goodness of the claim that 2/3 is 2 times 3 from the first slide. But getting to correctness can be housed under the synthetic unity without disregarding the transcendental. The existential need to be recognized as a good person is sufficient to motivate mathematical correctness. Part of what I mean by critical in critical mathematics is that the mathematical system, it is a mathematical system that knows itself to be incomplete. I'm trying to build discursive movement into the mathematical system. I take it that we live in existential fear of being booted out of our cognitive communities. Our status as normative subjects and our social identities are precarious things. But in between all that chatter, I literally exhaled and relaxed a little bit. For the duration of that exhalation, the inner soliloquy is muted. When we let go of a synthetic thought, before getting fully caught up with it, we experience the infinite as undifferentiation, the letting go of determinate thought. Some of you may not have experienced inner speech, but even so, I imagine you experienced a kind of rhythm between the synthetic and the transcendental unities of apperception, perhaps as a wave with moments of desire and reflective thought. However that reflective thought appears to your consciousness. You may not literally experience speech rehearsals like my, are they all going to laugh at me? But it may have been imagistic or something else. The point is that there seems to be a primordial rhythm between the infinite being and the synthetic knowing and reflecting. Another way to say this is that there is a rhythm between what psychologists might call a flow state, where being and knowing are united, a reflection on that flow state which breaks the flow, and a kind of letting go of that reflective synthetic state to return back to flow. We experience flow, the disruption of flow and reflection, and the dissolution of that disruptive reflection to return to flow. I experience this rhythm in silence, but it extends to dialogue as well, where the different actors alternate between these two existential needs of listening and speaking. To say this another way, there's a primordial rhythm between the I and the me and the I and the you. This rhythm is what I call the sound of time. There's a children's book titled The Monster at the End of This Book. In it, the monster-shaped drawing of a puppet named Grover becomes frightened of the actions of the reader. The book claims there is a monster at the end of the book, and this frightens Grover. He begs the reader not to keep turning the pages. Monsters are scary. But at the end of the book, Grover is the only one on the page, and he realizes that the reference to the monster at the end of the book was a reference to himself. Lovable Grover was the monster the whole time. Well, look at that. This is the end of the book, and the only one here is me. I, lovable, furry, old Grover, and the monster at the end of this book. How is such a story possible? How is it possible that Grover can refer to himself in terror without knowing it? For the sophisticated academic audience, how could Oedipus unwittingly sentence himself to exile for the murder of Laius? What this example is meant to suggest is that there are two fundamentally different sorts of identity, each with their own constituent existential needs. There is the undoubtable I of I am, and there is the social identity, the me. That is who I am for another person. There is an I and a me. The self is both an I, a locus of pure subjectivity and agency, and a me, a delimitable form, understood only from the perspective of others. What Grover misunderstood about himself is that he exists for the reader as a monster. His me is partly his monstrosity. Note that the me is tremulous. This aspect of our identity is tremulous because it depends on how we're recognized by another person, which changes from person to person and throughout time as we and they experience developmental movement. It is also essential because we are the ones who say we. Normativity is part of our existence. Who we are for another person extends beyond what we look like or our socio-political categories of identity. These are important parts of identity, and I imagine that critical mathematics can support scholars working in critical mathematics education, where the focus is more explicitly on justice. But how we are recognized also involves... But how we are recognized also involves the kinds of identity claims we make. For example, Grover's identity claims are ones like I am old, I am lovable, I am furry, and last, I'm a monster. How true does the last one feel? There's always something a little false about identity claims. They are false in part because they are totalizing. Such assertions are relativized against the whole field of possible assertions. Moreover, they're structurally broken as they attempt to express individuality through universals, concepts, or forms. Universals stand in particular relations to other universals, like red is a particular color, but the relation to their constituent particulars is one of negation. Red as a universal is the negation of the particularity of red things. Red requires those particulars for content, but it is not those particular red things. In Brandam's work, identity claims are understood as commitments that have the form of assertions. Assertions are the smallest unit of thought that we can take responsibility for that also make moves in a Wittgensteinian language game. Brandam's work moves us from first-person identity claims to second-person identity. Our commitments entitle others to make inferences about our identities. Sometimes those commitments are incompatible with one another. Grover's lovability and monstrosity seem not to coexist until we recognize that we're not meant to take the storybook to be a horror film. What are we to do in those cases where our commitments are incompatible? First off, it's important to understand that holding incompatible commitments doesn't just matter to other people. When we hold incompatible commitments and know it, we feel hypocritical. It feels bad. Such feelings mark a lack of integration between how we are recognized and our self-concepts. We have an existential need to be recognized as good, but holding incompatible commitments and not trying to repair them can preclude our being recognized at all. Hypocrisy threatens our status as normative subjects. Being a person is a process that involves acting for reasons rather than causes, being free and being accountable and trustworthy. When we hold incompatible commitments and do nothing to reduce those incompatibilities, our personhood is threatened because others cannot hold us to account. We are not trustworthy. The synthetic unity of apperception is where language and recognition join. For Brandam, the synthetic unity of apperception, the social side of good, is about attending to our incompatible commitments, acknowledging the inferential consequence of our commitments, and justifying those commitments. He calls these integrative synthetic task responsibilities. I like this phrase because it suggests they're doings related to integrating our social selves to a universalized self-concept, and that such doings are related to freedom as responsibility. The latter two responsibilities generally introduce more incompatibilities to our commitments that need to be repaired. That is, if we commit ourselves to A and justify that commitment through B, we often find a C that's an inferential consequent of B that's incompatible with A. It is work that's never done, but we can become more integrated with our universalized self-concepts, more trustworthy and more responsible. In the Kantian tradition, freedom is intimately related to responsibility. I take it that this kind of freedom, the ability to take responsibility for our commitments by justifying them and repairing them when they are found to be incompatible, is the idealized purpose of institutionalized education. Those actual institutions may operate under system-level interests to make for more obedient citizens or to enforce social castes, but my concern isn't system level. I'm really interested in the I, you, me, and we. Part of recognition involves language. Specifically, recognition involves language where our insides match our outsides. It is one place where knowing meets being, as our social being is in how we are known. The unity of knowing and being is an underdeveloped theme in critical theory, first reaching explicitness in Hegel. Likewise, action is where knowing meets being, for to do is to know oneself as doing. There is no separation between being and knowing, at least in the first moments of action. As actions end, we start to reflect on them and begin to experience knowing as separate from being. The flow breaks. You've probably had the experience of starting an action in full confidence, but towards the end of an action, feeling a great sense of regret and separation, saying, what am I doing? This occurs as we consider our actions from the perspective of others in reflection. The problem with recognition through language is that we have to use universals, concepts, or forms. For example, Grover uses the universals lovable, furry, old monster. In our particularity, we may chafe at these universals. We usually do when we feel labeled. Structurally, they cannot quite capture our individuality. In any case, we use them. How do they come about? The experience of air is a universal among those who say we. Random relates an experience of air wherein a stick underwater is perceived as bent. Here's a recreation. It's a pencil in a cup of water. You can see it's bent. The person experiencing the stick as bent can pull the stick out and realize that it's a straight stick. The bent stick is negated as a straight stick. But in Hegelian thinking, the stick isn't just a straight stick. It is a straight stick that appeared bent. The experience of air changes what the object is to consciousness. Our future encounters with bent sticks may be informed by this, and so appear to consciousness as bent sticks that may be straight. This has implications for teaching and learning. Asymmetries in the experience of air, where I may have experienced a wider range of airs than a student, leads to asymmetries in what we are talking about. You may be talking about bent sticks, while I may be talking about sticks that appear bent but may be straight. The experience of air is a crucial part of epistemology. We can now discuss mathematical form. Mathematical forms are recollections that negate the particular experiences of air and successful object negation. The form, or universal triangle, is a recollection that negates particulars. These particulars can be experienced as airs or as successful object negations. Form is the temporal compression of moments separated in time into a unity. That unity is negative and unrepresentable except as the negation of particulars. Here's a bunch of triangles, and they're all kind of sloppy. The form triangle is a recollection that is the not this of these particulars. It is temporal. It is a temporal compression because the moments that are separated in time are recalled in the same moment. If we were to try to represent the form triangle, we would just end up with another particular. Recollection is how experiences of air and successful object negations are temporally compressed into unities we call universals, forms, or concepts. I can recollect an experience from when I was 4 within an assertion that also recollects more recent experiences. For example, I ate potatoes when I was 4 and I ate potatoes yesterday. The doing of recollection is compressing time. I use braces idiosyncratically where others might use quotation marks. I do this with special care when discussing the I, because recollecting the I substantively changes it. Recollection has the quality of fixing the contents of whatever is recollected, and fixing the content of the I, in some sense, ruins it. The I never is what it is, and always is what it is not. The negative is movement. But the point of using braces like this is also to gain traction over the idea that we can get to a prototypical notion for mathematical sets by thinking of them as recollection. Mathematical sets usually have a lot more structure in terms of the axioms of set theory, but we can make inroads into that space by calling sets what they are, recollections. We can conceptualize the synthetic as recollective and so as a temporal compression. Perhaps this is another reason why identity claims feel inadequate. They are compressed. The experience of air, where we have a commitment to something like a bent stick and modify that commitment, so now it is a commitment to a straight stick, articulates a change in who we are for another. The me who believed in this bent stick is no more. Moreover, we might ask why I am entitled to claim a continuity of identity between my 4-year-old self and the one you see before you now. Kant remarked on the mindness of experience, which persists through changes in the me entailed by those experiences. What enables this continuity of identity is called the transcendental I. Transcendental in this context refers to some enabling condition. It should not be confused with transcendent, which generally refers to supersensible realities. In religion, transcendent stuff is soul stuff. In science, we might note that electrons and protons are not the objects of experience, so they are in some sense transcendent. Concepts of transcendent realities refer to beings, objects, forces, and/or processes that we cannot access through our senses. They can resemble the postulated entities used in scientific models today, such as neutron, electromagnetic field, gravitational force, etc. The last image is an example of picture thinking. Picture thinking is the archetypal mode of most of the physical sciences, besides the most recent quantum physics, that has been picked up by many philosophies of education. It assumes the observer position is the correct one. The idea behind picture thinking is that knowledge is like a picture of what is, taken from a position any possible sapient can, in principle, occupy. This does not square with Hegelian dialectics or with inferentialism, where knowledge is understood as movement. It also does not work to capture negatives like desire, which are generally not the object of desire. One hallmark of picture thinking is that it takes a temporal object of thought and represents it spatially. That is what is happening in the previous picture. Me sub 1 and me sub 2 are represented along a linear path of time. The now in such pictures is usually represented as a point, which limits our ability to understand our experiences as emerging from within an eternal and internally complex now. And this is probably the biggest problem with the sound of time metaphor. Form is temporal compression. What does it mean to temporally decompress? That would be non-form. The mode of negation in the synthetic is about distinctions, things not being other things, properties not being other properties, etc. Temporal decompression must be about letting go of synthetic distinctions. Non-form is the intentional undifferentiation of determinate concepts. It is the infinite as the non-finite, the dissolution of finite form. In the moment of silence, it was what I mentioned as an exhalation. It is a letting go of some determinateness that defines form. Derridian deconstruction allows us to take responsibility for intentional undifferentiation. The idea of deconstruction starts with a text which privileges one of two binary concepts, like speech and writing, in Derrida's archetypal deconstruction of Rousseau's thinking. Rousseau thought speech was more primordial. Derrida demonstrates that writing, the non-privileged concept, is in fact more primordial than speech, because we can't make sense of the idea of speech without its complement in the binary conceptual system, writing. In some sense, we had to have writing first before the concept of speech could be understood. A mathematical interpretation of Derridian deconstruction can be found in Priest's work. Intentional undifferentiation is pedagogically relevant for understanding the aha moment. The aha moment is the feeling of self-certainty. It involves intentional undifferentiation. For example, imagine a child who subtracts 12 minus 5 by counting down from 12 by 5 to obtain 7. That is by going 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. Imagine the same child, excuse me, imagine the same child counting up from 5 to get to 12 and counting their steps to obtain 7. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The child might realize that these two different ways of doing subtraction are the same and experience the aha moment. This is how I make sense of the aha moment. I would like to pause for just a moment to discuss how radical and powerful deconstruction is as a concept. Most of our cultural understandings of intelligence, knowledge, and education are purely synthetic. They're about how fast we can think, how nuanced our distinctions are. This is not necessarily true for criticalists, but the canon is almost exclusively about determinate negation. We have barely touched the surface of the infinite as a species. I think I can now explain the sound of time metaphor. The synthetic moment of the recognition desire, which is the existential need to be recognized as a good person, is primarily related to language, and so necessarily involves form. These forms are temporal compressions. The transcendental moment of the recognition desire, the existential need to be recognized as infinite, is about letting go of distinctions, and so is a temporal decompression. The exhalation I mentioned from the moment of silence is such a temporal decompression. Exhalation here is meant in an embodied sense, not precisely a biological one. This is not an empiricist framework. So the metaphor comes in here where we say sound is a wave that moves through air. The wave is composed of different regions of more compressed air and less compressed air. In the diagram, sound is represented as this kind of wave. With form and non-form, the wave is of compressed time and decompressed time. So the primordial rhythms between the synthetic and the transcendental moments of the recognition desire is the sound of time. In the previous image, we might note that the temporal object of thought is represented spatially. This is an example of picture thinking. We have sound moving along in a spatial way, temporal sound moving along in a spatial way. So it's totally inadequate because it cannot represent the negative. So while I do think the metaphor helps understand the primordial rhythm between the two moments of need or desire, it's ultimately just a metaphor. The less metaphorical way of talking about the relationship between the two moments of the recognition desire is through Brandam's notion of reciprocal sense dependence. The basic idea is that concepts like parent depend on concepts like child for their sense, and this relationship is reciprocal. Child depends for its sense on parent. For Frege, discursive symbols express a sense and thereby designate a referent. Senses are what is grasped when one understands the expression, and referents are what is thereby represented, what expressing that sense is talking or thinking about. In my interpretation, reciprocal sense dependence is an equivalence relation. It is symmetric, so A is related to A, in the sense that parent depends on the sense of parent. It is reflexive due to the reciprocity between the concepts of parent and child. A is in a relation to B, implies B is in a relation to A by virtue of this word reciprocal. Transitivity is a little bit more cumbersome to demonstrate because it requires three concepts. I discuss the details a little bit more in the dissertation using the triplicate concept of being, nothing, and becoming. This equivalence relation entitles claims like parent equals child, which is a way of taking responsibility for the intentional undifferentiation between the two concepts. We might look at that equation and say, no, right? Parent doesn't equal child. These are identities that don't seem to be fully held within one moment. This allows us to say that the synthetic and the transcendental, the finite and the infinite, form and non-form, are reciprocally sense-dependent. We cannot have form without its dissolution, and we cannot have its dissolution without form. I now turn to the second mathematical idea of the talk. I promised to talk about numbers in addition to form. I'll begin with the concept of anaphora. Anaphora is basically the ability to use pronouns. Brandam argues that anaphora has the quality of fixing linguistic contents by recollecting them within speech acts. This chalk is white. It is also cylindrical, and if it were to be rubbed on the board, it would make a mark. This is especially important for indexical expressions like now, that do not have determinate content unless so recollected. The now is eternal, and yet that now has passed. I used to teach high school and community college. Oops, I think I want to go on the next slide. Yeah. I used to teach high school and community college students. One of my first days teaching high school, I was assigned to teach a rudimentary algebra class for seniors who needed to pass an end-of-course assessment. In Indiana, these end-of-course assessments are serious business. Indiana is famous for its for-profit prisons and cornfields. The school-to-prison pipeline was not an abstract concept for me. It was a present danger, and passing these end-of-course assessments was a prerequisite for graduation and interrupting that pipeline. A student had died the prior weekend before school had started after being chased by police. The students were a wreck, but I insisted on teaching them some math. This remains a profound regret. One of the reasons I want to build a mathematical system on existential needs for recognition is to be able to better prioritize attending to those existential needs. They needed someone to hold space for them, to grieve with them, but I insisted on content. One of those students asked, after a few minutes of me prattling on about X, what are numbers? I think he was frustrated and confused and really didn't understand what algebra was about because he legitimately did not understand what numbers even are. I, being a total nerd, started talking about von Neumann ordinals. Von Neumann ordinals are a way to conceptualize numbers as collections of the empty set. The number 0 is represented as the empty set. The number 1 is the set that contains 0, so the set that contains the empty set. 2 is the set that contains 0 and 1, so 2 contains the empty set and the set that contains the empty set. I started drawing braces with nothing inside of them, talking about the elegance of nothingness. I could feel the gulf between us grow. He wasn't understanding what I was getting at, and I just felt awful. Here I was prioritizing nothingness and symbolic elegance over the suffering these students were experiencing because they had just lost their friend, and it wasn't even making sense. I could not even explain what numbers even are. As problematic as von Neumann ordinals were in that space, I still want to use them as a normative standard of assessment. My central claim, there we go. My central claim is in this section is that numbers are anaphoric terms. They function as pronouns. First, pronouns are promiscuous. He can refer to many different he's. Numbers can refer to many different object collections, like 2 apples or 2 sunsets. Frege got to numbers by abstracting over object collections, but I want to take a different route. Let us start with the sentence, "You are beautiful." As I mentioned at the top, what unifies this assertion is the desire for recognition, or the I. Symbolizing the I with the null representation yields the example sentence, here, with the null representation, "You are beautiful." With the understanding that the I is staked in such a communicative act, there are consequences for saying such a thing. Others are entitled to make inferences based on this commitment. Recall too that I substitute braces for our everyday symbol for recollection, which is the next step here. The brace, empty set, "You are beautiful." With this substitution in hand, we can rewrite the sentence, "You are beautiful." This has the von Neumann structure of 1. We can also recollect this sentence. I can say, when I said "you are beautiful," I meant it. Here the I is staked in 2 places. It is staked in the act of recollection and in the recalled speech. I could rewrite this sentence as the empty set. When I said "empty set, you are beautiful," close brackets, I meant it. This has the von Neumann structure for 2. I could then recollect this recollection to obtain the von Neumann structure for 3. This allows for an actual definition of the successor function as a recollection. N plus 1 is the recollection of n. To interpret this a bit more, the sentence for 2 is basically saying, I think, and in so thinking, I recollect a prior thought. I think when I said, and in so thinking, I recollect a prior thought, "You are beautiful." I italicized it in the prior example because this is a type of pronoun category that numbers belong to. In the example sentence, it functioned as a first-person recollective pronoun. Numbers function in the same way. 2 is the it that recalls thoughts of the form, I think, and in so thinking, I recollect a prior thought. So von Neumann ordinals form a backstop of number in critical mathematics as I conceptualize the project. A crucial difference is that I don't really think of the empty set. Rather, I think of the null representation, building number out of the desire to be recognized, or intersubjectivity, or moments of the I. But I could have answered that student's question with, well, numbers are pronouns. They refer to thinking that requires other thoughts to be understood. That might have gone over a little better than mere emptiness, but who knows? I'm not thinking about this stuff as a curriculum yet, which is a severe weakness of the project. That concludes my talk. I would like to return to a moment of silence. I hope this time around that the silence is better understood. I do this to close the hermeneutic circle for this talk so that it might mean something while resisting picture thinking. Questions and discussions will follow, but let us be silent for a moment in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you very much. So now let's take some questions if there are any. Oh, a visual argument from David Bowers, cool.
Wonderful talk, Tia. Thank you so much. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'll moderate the chat box, or feel free to speak up if you'd like. Questions and comments, discussion points.
Thank you, Jess.
I would like to disagree with you on one thing, Tio, and that was that you said that a weakness of the project was that you haven't thought about it as a curriculum yet. I don't think that's a weakness of the project. What you're doing is a lot of really heavy lifting at a very fundamental level, and you know, you can't jump to application that easily. So I don't think that that's a weakness of the project by any means. I think you need to give yourself more credit than that, because what you're thinking about here is pretty extraordinary.
Thank you.
The
yeah,
IU folks have a question.
Oh, great.
IU folks, if y'all want to speak up. Oh, hang on just a second. I had turned off the unmuting. Okay, everybody can unmute themselves now.
Okay, go ahead. Hi, Tio. Hi, Phil. It's so nice to see you both. I just find this so interesting because the student-centered learning, the implications of epistemology and handling error, and also the importance of silence in helping students believe that they're mathematical. I think that those two ideas are so profound. And are you going to wrap student-centered learning into this project? Do you intend to do that? I don't even know what to ask you because I find all this so interesting. So I just want to start a conversation around that.
Yeah.
About the importance of error and epistemology and the importance of silence when you're actually teaching students who don't believe that they're mathematical. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that recognizing existential needs here, the existential needs are universal, but they're also just deeply particular, right? In the specific moments that we're experiencing them. I think we can recognize other people in terms of their needs, right? So if we have somebody who's sort of not doing their homework or something, not participating in class, I think that kind of probably is coming from like the lack of recognition as infinite, right? There's this sort of interpolation of them as bad people that I think is that really needs to be counteracted with this idea. No, that like we're vast. I mean, we're vast, right? We're not just the sort of flesh and bones. So yes, I think in terms of student-centeredness, getting to these recognition desires, getting to the existential needs, allows us to really understand students in their particularity.
Can you unmute?
I did.
You did. Thank you, Lori. And this really is about culture. What it really comes down to, in my mind, is classroom culture and establishing that recognition that they exist and that they have meaningful contributions. Because every classroom and every math teacher would agree, all students possess a wealth of knowledge. It's not all the same. And that intersubjectivity between them fills in so many gaps and helps them to be recognized as mathematical. So I find your work very exciting in this respect.
Thank you. Yes, just to respond a little bit in terms of the culture, I was trying to get at that a little bit when I was talking about the institute, CPPI, the Critical Philosophical Psychoanalytic Institute for Mathematics Education, what we are all experiencing right now, where I was talking about the word critical, right? And how that allows or invites the critique of the communicative norms of a particular space. So like, for example, when I taught high school, I tried to be democratic about the kinds of norms that were asserted, right? And allowed those norms to be critiqued and editable. So it's sort of like we can experience movement in that. So I think, yeah, those cultural systems that sort of are inviting their own critique are positioned to meet that existential need to be recognized as infinite.
I think that is key in your research, is recognition. And I heard you talk about it over and over. And I think it's really important. And I would encourage you to keep emphasizing it, because what I have found in my own experience teaching developmental math students is that the more that you recognize them, and I know Hyun Jung would agree, who's here with me, because she teaches that course as well. The more that you recognize students as mathematical and value their contributions and the way that you handle error as part of the learning process, students begin to believe that they're mathematical, and then they grow, and then they do well. So I think that you've touched on something so fundamental and so important here, and I thank you for that. I think it's important.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think, yeah, so that idea that we need to recognize them as mathematical, I would house that under this idea that that everybody needs to be recognized as good, right? It's not just about correctness or incorrectness. They have to be, invited into the recognitive community. Thank you. Are there other folks that would like to ask questions or start interact with Sharon here?
You have a few accolades in the chat box.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you very much to all these folks, Dan and Mina and Phil and Jess. I appreciate that.
I'd like to ask a question to you.
Mhm.
So today and I have not read your dissertation, but today you talked about number and form. Do you have any, are you going to be extending this to other sorts, or thought about extending this to other sorts of things, like what is a variable or some other mathematical concept like that? I primarily teach geometry, and so I think that there's a lot of promise for sort of representing and understanding geometric ideas this way.
Yes. Hold on just 1 second. Had to grab a book off my bookshelf. So in the paper that I mentioned at the top, that I wrote in 2020, I do get to operation using Robert Brandam's incompatibility semantics. And in the dissertation, I interpret the spatial models of quantity, so like the circles with radial partitions and that sort of thing, as anaphoric terms. So it's sort of building this linguistic and spatial stuff together. But in that 2020 paper, I was sort of taking this book by Lakoff and Nunez and reading it through Brandam's work, these incompatibility semantics. And basically, I got through the first 30 pages of this. And it was, so in terms of further extensions, I think that there's kind of a recipe in that paper for extending this to all kinds of different things. So yeah, the other math is involved there, but I haven't. I mean, I haven't actually gotten to variables in my own thinking yet. But I think this talk of sort of desire that wants to be filled is often how we're thinking about X's. So.
Yeah, no, that's where my mind was going, but I just wanted to get your thoughts about it. And I think one of the things that we, at least we in this sort of area of our field face a lot is the whole question: where's the math? Or, are you really doing educational psychology, or are you really doing math education? That kind of question. And for me, it always seems like there's all of this affect psychological stuff that's sort of layered on top of the textbook mathematics. And so it's all of these sort of, ways of dealing with that concrete, universalized mathematics that's there printed in the little blue boxes, right? And it's almost like we're just wrapping ourselves around that stuff. And I just have never really been satisfied with that sort of approach to math education. I feel like that's sort of naive at this point. And so I really like the promises that your thinking gives in terms of sort of getting away from that question. I think a lot of us here are probably tired of hearing that question.
Well, yeah, so I think right. There's this interesting tension, I think, in my work between the synthetic and the transcendental, because we do want to be able to sort of have the math. I think it doesn't really matter what kind of scholarship we're doing. We still have to be able to number our pages correctly, right? There's some sort of practical things that we use math for, and in addition to the sort of wild out there ideas. So this push and pull between the synthetic and the transcendental, I think, allows for a more discovery oriented approach to learning that's still sort of like, we want to get it right. I really do think that people want to get it right. David has a question here in the box that's really wonderful. Thing I'm wondering and thinking about: time as we experience it is of course culturally constructed. Queer scholars talk about queer time and the way time can hold different meanings to for queer people. I wonder what happens when we bring your metaphor of time in conversation with notions of queer time. What other observations, undifferentiations might that help surface? Beautiful thought, right? And I would also say that there's a concept of crypt time, which has to do with how the disability community understands time as not empirical time, right? Empirical time has to do with cesium atoms decaying, or quartz crystals in a watch as they sort of do something with electrons that I don't understand, right? But that isn't our experience of time. Our experience of time isn't empirical time. Empirical time is an imposition from a third person perspective, and that third person perspective doesn't make any sense about time, right? When we get to the quantum level, that isn't how time works. There isn't an objective third person position on time. So not only is the concept of empirical time not what we experience, but it's also not doing what it purports to do, right? So it's a broken concept. So I think this idea of queer time or crypt time is very sympathetic with the kind of work that I'm talking about here, where what's almost like what's creating time, our temporal experiences, are these rhythms, between the synthetic and the transcendental, as I imagine it, right? And but that being said, I don't have a fully worked out theory of time yet, for what time is. It seems like it's internally complex, the now. But thank you for asking that, David.
That was a very good question. I think, yeah, I think you're right with the queer time and crypt time, because it privileges the subjectivity first. I wrote something once where I used some phrase like, I'm trying to think of it now, but something like the great synchronous code between us. And that's like what we're trying to get at with this objectivity. But, you know, anyway, that's a fleeting thought right now.
Yeah. And I think just to maybe complicate the point a little bit, that these recognition desires and these temporal compressions, I do think that we experience those dialogically, right? We experience those with other people, and so we can have sort of that. I don't want to be thinking about just the lonely experience in silence. What is time for that consciousness? It's also these rhythms that we have with other people that I think can really push us forward to understanding our connectedness.
Hi, Theo. I have a question. It might be a minor point, but at one point in your presentation, you talk about writing and speaking as probably two formats that are really interconnected with each other, interconnected to I and being. So I wonder, in math education or math as a discipline, how would you say the intersection between math and writing and speaking? That makes sense.
That's a wonderful question, and one that I don't have worked out very well at all. And part of the problem, I mean, just delivering this talk, right? Here I am using symbols that are unpronounceable, right? The empty set or the null representation is, I mean, they have names, but they don't, they're not letters in the alphabet. So in terms of like, how do we speak this? It's very much a symbolic kind of language. And so I think that those symbols are forms, and that those forms are temporal compressions. And so writing is a very condensed, temporally condensed medium. It's condensing time, compressing time completely into space, right? The written word is a spatial object. And so then what the reader has to do is decompress temporally, which I think involves sort of like position taking with the author, undifferentiating between the subject position of the reader and author, and also like doing this question of like, what are they trying to get at? What is this supposed to be doing? To temporally decompress the written word. But yeah, what is math? I mean, I think it's spoken, right? It's written. Yeah, good question. Ooh, unpronounceable. Okay, I don't know enough Lovecraft. Ooh, cool. Lacan. So you all are thinking about this as well. Beautiful.
So Theo, I have a question. I have a couple. Which one should I ask? Yeah, so you're doing a lot with the notion of the I, you know, transcendental I and so on, and the me. But you've kind of, I mean, something is happening with your work that's really cool. It's very Hegelian. But it has to do with the I kind of being outside as well as inside. Yeah. So, and I would imagine that's one of the harder things to communicate to people, although I think you're right about it really, really well, really well.
Thank you.
But do you have anything to say about that? It's a real different ontology. It's a Hegelian-like ontology.
Yeah, right. So I think that we sort of have a mathematically necessary idea of inside and outside in order to sort of understand what a region in space is. We have to sort of understand what's outside of that region and what's inside of that region. And so I think that there's some necessary distinction there. And in the 2020 paper, I try to model that distinction on the feeling body, in the sense that like my experiences of the body feeling don't extend to your experiences of the body feeling. Right? There's sort of we sort of have this necessary boundary between us.
Yeah,
but I think in the meditative space, we don't necessarily experience those as insides and outsides, right? There's a real unity in terms of like just being, right? So when we get to that infinite space where we're just being and we're not reflecting on it, I think the distinction between inside and outside kind of dissolves. Was that kind of what you were getting at, Phil, or was there another idea that you had in mind?
Yeah, there's a whole lot packed into that, because I think you're doing a really brilliant project. It really is it has an ontological aspect to it that isn't in our cultural common sense. And I would imagine that that's difficult to convey a lot of the stuff you're doing. So I just wanted to hear you talk more about it. I think what you said about inside outside is right on. It was really good.
And you mentioned
In a
another
way, another question in a way is related is, so math philosophies are categorized a lot of times into like formalists, logicists, structuralists, Platonists. Where would you locate what you're doing in relation to that typology of math philosophies?
Oh, that's a good question. I am sort of right. There's a pragmatist bent, and so there's a certain amount of doing. Right, the doing of math, I think, is part of my philosophy, which makes something like the formalist approach feel a little bit foreign to what I'm trying to understand math as. But that being said, I have this sort of respect for the formal mathematics philosophies and the formal languages that sort of arise out of this synthetic need to be represented as good people, recognized as good people. And so I think we can sort of, I'd like to think that the experience of error is so fundamental, and the experience of development, right, where we're thinking about what fourth graders or 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds are thinking as this is like a mathematical representation. So it's contributing to the body of mathematics. I think that combination of math education and mathematics, right, a philosophy of math that uses the material of mathematics education in its understanding of pragmatism, I think is not totally represented in the typology, but perhaps I'm missing something.
Yeah. I think there's some big things that I haven't seen in that typology that you're actually addressing. Anyway, that's all, Theo. I admire you so very much.
Thanks,
You're
Phil.
doing great work.
This is Phil, who I cited about 5 times uh, in the paper. So thank you, Phil. I admire you a lot too. Okay, David says, it is noteworthy to me that situating knowledge, meaning, and flux or flow has more in common with various indigenous knowledge systems than it does with Platonism, formalism, etc. That's a wonderful comment. Yeah. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
I don't know how much unpacking I can do off the cuff, but you know, and I recognize that you didn't you know, follow directly from like an indigenous you know, intellectual lineage, but I do find it meaningful that you're arriving at some of the same metaphors for making sense of these things that we're doing, and how that distinguishes from the more colonial omnipresence that we all suffer under.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm really appreciate that you recognize that, because I do sort of, you know, in the back of my head, I've been thinking about ethnomathematics as a concept, and you know, just deeply appreciating it for its contribution to math education, but also sort of feeling like, well, that's the math of others. Oh, bye, folks. Right, and so the math of others is this sort of separation, you know, enforces a kind of separation that, you know, the math of others won't ever be the math of myself, right? And so I do I do see a kind of relationship between this project and ethnomathematics.
I'll make a comment that may be food for thought for later. But one of my colleagues here at Virginia Tech is really into sort of like indigenous spirituality and medicine and those sorts of things. And I don't really know much about that, but she works closely with shaman and sort of things of that nature. Well, of course, anybody that hangs around me, I eventually try to get them to read Hegel. And I got her to read Hegel. I said, okay, just read like the first 50 pages of Phenomenology of Spirit and then talk. And she calls me, she goes, Alex, I can't believe this. This is the same thing that my shaman had been saying for hundreds of years.
That's funny.
I said, well, that's good to know.
Yeah, yeah. There's a real sort of Hegel's a pretty different way of thinking about things from you know what I learned about knowledge in my teacher education, right? Which is sort of like psychology, and you know, we have a lot of pictures of what knowledge is. That yeah, yeah, we get into this way more interesting space that doesn't. I mean, what I find so beautiful about it is it's just like never ending, right? We're just like, I'm growing in my understanding. I still feel like a total babe in arms here, in terms of like my understanding of Hegel and my understanding of the universe, which is just lovely to go from, you know, the sort of arrogance of pure mathematics, right? It's sort of a you know, you think you know it all, to go from that to this, like, yeah, just the world is wide open. It's really pretty cool.
Any other questions?
Well, let me, before we end, let me just say how deeply I appreciate all of your time and your comments and your energy unpacking this with me. It's just been really lovely. So thank you. Oh, I would like to have Ivan, can you say a little bit more?
They're gone.
Oh, okay. I don't quite
No
understand the
worries.
comment.
Neither do I, but that's okay.
All right. Well, thank you for committing it, Ivan. I'd be happy to talk to you more about it later. Hi, David.
Yeah, actually, I'll make a quick comment, Tio, before I'm afraid I had to run away from the computer, so I wasn't able to hear all of the conversation that was going on in between. But is there something, in listening to your presentation, it strikes me as what you're thinking about and expressing applies to human experience. And is there something unique about mathematics that makes it more difficult to access that experience than other realms of thought and discourse? Because it seems like you have the same problem of understanding, of relating to other topics other than just math. But is there something unique about math that cuts off that experiential element that you're trying to get at?
Yes. I think there is something unique about math, and it has to do with that formalism. In the it's a discipline of thought that from Euclid on down has been about proof, which is about certainty, right? And this is in Western mathematics, right? In pragmatist mathematics around the globe or ethnomathematics, I think that it's not about axioms, right? It's I mean, the Egyptians started using math for taxes. It's always been sort of instrumental or about certainty in ways that like nobody, I don't think anybody ever thought, now the novel is dead, right? We don't need to write any more novels because the form is complete. Whereas that's like kind of what at the turn of the 19th century, the movement in mathematics, formal mathematics, was all about, was getting this formal language, Frege's Begriffsschrift, the successors of that, to get to certainty. And so to get to certainty is an impossibility, sort of, right? A contentful certainty is an impossibility. A non-contentful self-certainty is, right? We can be here now and feel self-certain of that. But when we try to ascribe content to that certainty, the content alienates the certainty. We're no longer actually experiencing certainty. We just sort of remember, hey, it feels like we were. So I think the cultural inheritance of axiomatic thinking, which gives us so much beautiful stuff, I'm not trying to knock it, but in terms of like what our educational experience of mathematics is, for example, we really need to get away from thinking about things in terms of certainty, I think.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I just when I listen, I do think that math is probably on a polar extreme, but all forms of discourse benefit from deconstruction, whether it's law or science or aesthetics or whatever it might be. But I suppose there is something unusually rigid about certain forms, or probably the dominant forms of mathematical thinking that you're addressing.
Yeah.
But what you're saying, obviously it has applications in other fields other than mathematics, but perhaps even more so in mathematics.
Yes, I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad you're bringing that up because I do envision the project as being applicable immediately to STEM type of discourses. But I think it's also, I mean, the idea of existential needs cuts across every field, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's all there. How do we recognize people for these for their existential needs? And I would just say also that like the formalist push is a historical event in the history of mathematics, right? So it's something that we inherited a particular way of thinking about math in this condition that we're in right now, that I'm in anyway, in Indiana. And so that I think that we can critique that culture also.
Thank you.
That's what I was thinking about too, Tio. It's like, you know, what you're describing made me think of this turn of phrase that Lacan uses a lot, called that which does not stop being written. Some things, you know, if you can describe it, then you can write it and you're done, right? But there's a lot of things that never stop being written because they're never done being described, or they're never done being written about because we really don't understand it. And so what happens, and this really situates our work firmly in mathematics education, right? Because what I think happens is, from the educational experience of infancy, when we're first given blocks and we're counting with blocks and things like that, we experience mathematics as it is, you know, given to us by our parents, by our teachers, by our school system, by our culture and society. We experience it as if it is done because that's the way it's presented to us. And that imprints on us at a very young age. And so then we do the rest of our lives trying to get over that, get out from under it rather. And if you are one who has the inclination and the opportunity and so forth, you can get into college and study math in college. And by your fourth year, you know, you're doing real analysis where you're starting to realize, oh, like it's not like it was in elementary school. And I do have some creative license here and things like that to continue writing mathematics. And so, but you know, what is our work? Our work is in math education, and so we really have this task in front of us of sort of undoing this false completion that we teach math with, you know, and that is a math education issue. So you speak of, Brian said, you speak of an experiencing of others' mathematics. Oh yeah, for sure. Yes. Yeah. It's, you know, it's the one in the blue box, mathematics, or it's the teacher who knows in place of the students knowing, you know, or the mathematics that knows in place of my own knowing, because even if I don't understand it, the math knows itself. So I'm okay. You know, I can bypass that.
I wanted to respond a little bit to something. Oh, sorry, Brian, were you going to respond?
Nope.
Okay. I just wanted to say that my experience of math as a college student was, eventually when we got to the point where we could critique the axioms, where the conversation was about what sorts of axioms should we use to prove different things, then it opens up this whole expressive space, right? Oh, it turns out mathematics is about expression. And I think that we can distinguish that from Dan's comment a little bit, like what makes math uniquely, whatever it is. I would say it has to do with using math as a measurement, right? There's some, when we are experiencing math as measuring, we're almost necessarily instrumentalizing the world, right? We're thinking about the world in terms of objects rather than in terms of subjects when we start doing measuring with math. So I think that would be one of the sort of differences, that novels don't necessarily instrumentalize their readers, for example.
We get enjoyment. I know we're creeping out of time. I just keep having so many thoughts. We get enjoyment out of instrumentalizing the world, out of controlling it. I mean, we enjoy it, which is why we do it. So it's sort of like we have this, we've fallen into this trap now where we have condemned ourselves to this viewing of mathematics as already being written, having been written, and yet we enjoy the consequences of that. But then it's like we have to suffer through. It's like getting through the mathematics in order to be able to do this. And the ones that are able to master that, you know, they have lots of things in front of them in life. And I think that was Sohn Rathel that said, if you can master mathematics, then you are an intellectual laborer and you do not have to do manual labor. So,
Yeah. Right. So this, just to speak to a little bit of that, there's this, in the talk I was talking about the recognition desire, and how the recognition desire is this like fundamental force, right? Or fundamental nothingness or absence, that can sort of be filled with acts of consumption, right? So object negations can sort of fulfill desire. We get this feeling of self-certainty, momentary certainty through the act of consumption, which I think is that enjoyment of instrumentalizing the world, right? We're negating the autonomy of the world through our understanding of it.
yeah.
And so that's sort of filling that desire in a way that, like, no, we can fill that desire with recognition. Right? We can be talking to one another and figuring out the world in terms of like how open we are to it, right? Rather than how controlling we are of it.
Much of everything you're saying, though, is also in terms of you can only know what is by knowing the null set. That's also true with regard to language itself. I mean, you have to know what a block is. You have to know what a not block is. And so all the ideas that you're talking about are and somehow through convention, maybe going back to Euclidean geometry and the axioms that were established by Euclid, we've all kind of agreed that there's value in limiting our controlling our creativity, accepting at least the illusion that these axioms are agreed upon and subjectively understood. Whereas maybe in other fields where just it's easier for us to understand the fluidity of existence and how it affects our concepts, but somehow we've just kind of agreed, maybe on pragmatic terms, that if we're going to make some progress, we understand that there's non-Euclidean geometry, but right now all we need is Euclid. If you're going to be a surveyor like Rachel, you don't really need to get beyond Euclid, and because it works. So yeah, I think it's great that you could bring this to your students to kind of like point out, even in math, we're socially constructing our existence as we go, and don't just think that just because we have these assumptions doesn't mean we're taking the me and the I distinction out of this. That it's still there, and if they can buy that for mathematics, then it's going to help them in their understanding other world phenomenons that they have as well that they're dealing with, whatever it might be.
Right. So you're bringing up an important point, I think, that I was trying to get at, which is that the synthetic and the transcendental need each other, right? So the synthetic is these normative agreements. So we could call those axioms, right?
Okay.
And I think it's this tension between those, right? That my sort of philosophy of math isn't going to dismiss the synthetic, right? The fact that we can sit down and agree to axioms and prove things or discover something about the world is awesome, right? It's part of the but it's normative, right? It's about agreements, which I think was one of the profound legs up in terms of like my education. When I got to college at Earlham, the mathematicians there were a united front that math is normative. It's about agreements. It's about coming to agreements after tenaciously trying to solve problems. So I don't want to dismiss the synthetic in favor of the infinite, right? They just I think that they exist together.
Which is very Hegelian.
Yeah, I heard Hegel is one of the least punk philosophers. I think because of this acceptance of normativity.
Yeah.
I suppose I am as well.
Yeah. I'm happy to turn the host permissions over to Tio, but I have a flight to go catch in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think I'd better go too. So
Thank you all for
Thank you.
coming and sticking around for the discussion. Thank you, Tio, again. This was wonderful.
my pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank
care.
you. Bye-bye.